And now news from around the world, and meanwhile in. Meanwhile, in Hong Kong, the authoritarian crackdown on the absolutely massive pro-democracy protests that we've seen, literally numbering in the millions and sustained for longer than I think I've ever seen a protest sustained for. They've come from the authoritarians in both ridiculous and horrendous forms. So first, the ridiculous. The South China Morning Post reports that customs officials in mainland China have ordered courier firms not to send black clothes and many other items used by protesters across the border. One firm says that the list of items it's banned from delivering to Hong Kong includes yellow helmets, yellow umbrellas, flags, flag poles, poster banners, gloves, masks, black t-shirts, metal rods, fluorescent tubes, and bludgeon clubs, which are apparently a product that you can buy. But anyway, this sort of petty attempt to make it slightly more difficult for the protesters to coordinate their outfits seems a little bit short-sighted, and many protesters reached for comment on this, said, "We can wear other colors," which I think they can easily do. Harder to bounce back from, though, is the violence against these protesters, and that reached really dangerous levels. There have been people who've been, there's been deadly violence already, but one of the leaders was attacked recently. This is Jimmy Sham, who leads the Civil Human Rights Front and has been actively involved in the months-long anti-government protest movement, was left bloodied and dazed after an attack Wednesday evening. He was apparently attacked by a group of 5 or 6 individuals wielding hammers. They beat him with hammers, and when bystanders tried to intervene, they were threatened themselves, again, to be beaten potentially to death with hammers. And this individual, who again, had just been recently attacked in just about as horrendous a fashion as I can possibly imagine. His colleague says, when Jimmy Sham was taken out of the ambulance, he told me 5 demands, not 1 less. Like he could potentially die. And he's saying, we don't back down 1 bit. And for those of you who might not have been following this, the 5 demands are the complete withdrawal of the extradition bill, establishment of an independent commission of inquiry into police conduct, retraction of the designation of riot to describe the protests, amnesty for arrested protesters, and full democracy. And many, many people have already been arrested. And so, I mean, you can't help but look on this movement and just think, this is what we should be seeing. These are people who are sustaining this movement under unimaginable circumstances for longer than I could have possibly imagined, even at risk to their own lives and not backing down. And that is, look, it's obviously very dark, but in another way, it's also incredibly heartwarming. Meanwhile, in the oceans, environmental regulations have apparently accomplished their goals when it comes to rejuvenating a species that had been down to virtual extinction. One of the whale populations taken to the edge of extinction by commercial hunting in the early 20th century has essentially recovered its numbers. This is humpback whales. This group was reduced to only a few hundred. The entire species, a few hundred, because of steam-driven boats and harpoons operated the British overseas territory of South Georgia. It was so bad at one point that even though this same industry was still trying to exploit the whales, they found it almost impossible to do so because there were so few they couldn't even find them. And so it got down to hunting of about a dozen or so a year, not for want of trying. And so international regulations to try to protect this species were put into effect, and it's reckoned there are now just short of 25,000 individuals in the Southwest Atlantic, more than 90% of the pre-exploitation level, which is amazing. I mean, they were this close to dying out entirely. We're done with that species, and international governments took it seriously, put protections in place, and even though there are still some trying to do this sort of whaling, and there's still a lot of whaling going on for other species, it has been almost entirely successful. This is a reminder that when governments actually agree to do what's necessary to protect the environment and those that live in it, it can be successful. Meanwhile, Meanwhile, the UK has been the site of near constant protests by Extinction Rebellion and other pro-environmental, anti-climate change activist groups for some time. The UK government recently decided that's enough of that, and they decided to ban the protests from the entirety of London, which is apparently a thing they can do, or at least they can try to do. On Monday, Scotland Yard issued a Section 14 order banning the group, the Extinction Rebellion, from demonstrating anywhere in the capital. A judicial review of the ban, which the group's lawyers say is disproportionate and unlawful, will be held this afternoon, actually. The order has been condemned by the Green Party and the Labour Party, with Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott describing it as completely contrary to Britain's long-held traditions of policing by consent, freedom of speech, and the right to protest. Now, of course, we have to acknowledge that Britain does not have the same sort of constitution nor Bill of Rights that we have here in the United States, but that does not mean that they don't have a history of at least general protections of freedom of speech and the ability to assemble and to protest. And apparently, that long history has run up against inconvenience over streets being blocked. And yes, I understand that if your commute is delayed, slowed down by these protests, that's going to be inconvenient. I would argue though that the full effects of a greater than 2 degrees Celsius rise in global average temperatures is going to end up being, in a variety of ways, more inconvenient for you, and not just when it comes to your commute. And it is difficult for regular people to see beyond the day-to-day difficulties that they face. They are very real, I understand that. But thankfully there are people who are looking ahead to the future, and Extinction Rebellion is a great example of that. One other great example of that is Greta Thunberg, who talked about these bans and said this: if standing up against the climate and ecological breakdown and for humanity is against the rules, then the rules must be broken. And she's 100% right. I have no doubt that if people do continue to protest, and by the way, they are right now. They have decided not to abide by this ban. They are still protesting. They could be locked up. They could face serious consequences. But the world is facing more serious consequences. And thankfully, we have people operating here in the United States, in the UK, and around the world who are finally taking it seriously. And they're not gonna let some ban on protests stop them from doing that. And so thank you to Greta, thank you to Extinction Rebellion for doing that. The stakes could not be any higher. Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.